Earlier this year, Woozle released an updated version of his GBA Consolizer kit, a kit that allows you to take a Game Boy Advance and modify it so that you can use it on your television. And while the kit features the same HDMI output up to 720p, instead of having to solder a bunch of test points to a quick solder board, this version of the mod kit features a flex cable, which might be a little bit intimidating to some intermediate modders. It makes the process a whole lot cleaner and easier. Also, the case has been redesigned to be completely screwless. Let's jump over to the bench and I'll show you how to put it together. The first thing that we're gonna need is a normal Game Boy Advance. This one happens to be really super disgusting, so it's a pretty prime candidate. We need to take this case apart and get at the PCB that's inside. Ugh, I don't even want to show this on camera, it's so disgusting. In order to take the Game Boy Advance apart, we need to use a tri-wing screwdriver. They're included with the iFixit kit that I have linked in my description. This last one here at the bottom is a normal Phillips screw. And we should be able to take this apart. And then we have a couple of more screws inside that hold the PCB to the case. Let's also disconnect this LCD flex cable. And take the PCB out of the case. I can put all this aside. I'd like to clean this PCB before we get started, but first let's remove this speaker over here. I should just be able to heat up this solder and pull the wires out. I'm gonna go clean this PCB with some isopropyl alcohol. Alright, now that the board is clean, let's go ahead and finish preparing this PCB. We need to bypass this volume knob by making a solder bridge on the first 3 pins. I should be able to do that with my normal chisel tip. If you're having problems with this, you can just add some flux and then just bridge those pins. With the volume knob bypassed, let's go ahead and flip it over. And now we need to remove these 2 battery terminals. Let's go ahead and heat up this pad. Maybe place something underneath the board. This piece should come right off. Now let's do the same thing for the other terminal. And that's pretty much it. Now that we have the battery terminals removed, let's go ahead and flip it back over. And now we have to remove this power switch over here. Now I still don't have a hot air rework station, and that would make this a really easy job, but I'm gonna try to remove it like I did last time. First I'm gonna try to use my chisel tip, but if I have to, I'll switch to my knife edge tip. I did break the top of the switch off, but I'm gonna switch to my knife edge tip so that I can get at those pins at the back. The knife edge tip really helped a lot. Let's go ahead and use some solder braid to clean up the pads. With the switch removed, now we have to bridge the left 2 pads there so that when the Consolizer turns on, the Game Boy Advance will turn on. The knife edge tip isn't letting me bridge those pads, so back to the chisel tip I go. Yeah, that was a lot easier. The last thing we need to do before we can solder the flex cable is to remove the oscillator right here. I'm going to use the Game Tech strategy again, which is just to rip it off with some pliers. Just like that. With the crystal removed, now we have to prepare to install the flex cable. Go ahead and take this weird looking one out of this package. If you try to line up the flex cable where it's supposed to go, you'll see that there's a little window in there that shows a capacitor underneath. However, if you move that flex cable over a little bit, you'll notice that there's another resistor that's right underneath the path that the flex cable is going to take. We're going to need to remove that resistor that's in the way, known as R5. I believe that this R1 resistor on the flex cable is the replacement for R5, it's just in a different place. Using my normal knife edge tip, we could do a pretty easy technique to remove R5. Go ahead and add some solder to both sides. And then if we turn it sideways here, we should be able to move the iron back and forth between the 2 ends of the resistor and it should slide right off. Just like that. And now using a nice clean piece of solder braid, we can go ahead and clean the solder up from that resistor we just removed. And with a little alcohol, we can clean up that area. Now I'm going to swap my tip for a J-tip and put the flex cable back in position. This is going to be a little bit difficult because there are pins on both the side here as well as this side on the left. And just remember that these flex cables go in front of the pins, not on top of them. I'm going to add a little flux to the bottom set of pins and get a tiny bit of solder on my iron. And if both the top and the sides look good, go ahead and try to tack down the bottom side here. Don't worry about bridging any pins just yet, just make sure that you try to line up all the pins on the left and the bottom side. Now that this bottom side is tacked down, I want to turn this around and tack down this top side as well, just so that everything stays square while I'm heating up the rest of the pins. So again, add some flux, get a little solder on the iron, make sure that all the pins are lined up, and then tack it down. Alright, let's turn this around again and try to finish this bottom side. If we add a little bit of flux and get a tiny bit more solder, let's try a little bit of drag soldering on these pins. If we have a little bit of a bridge here, we can use some solder braid and try to soak up a little of that solder. Mine came out something like that. Let's go ahead and do the same thing on this left side. We already have a fair bit of solder, so let's just go ahead and drag that around. Mine came out something like that. With this main flex cable out of the way, go ahead and grab our flex cable sheet again, and let's pop out these long skinny strips here. We're going to use these little strips to attach the negative and positive battery terminals to this 3.3 and G pads on the flex cable. First, let's tin these pads. And we'll solder a strip to each one of those pads. And now we'll take the 3.3 volt strip and try to solder it to the positive battery terminal. And then the ground strip to the negative battery terminal. And that should be everything for the main GBA board soldering. Let's put this aside for a second, and we'll grab the Consolizer board. We're going to need to solder this Super Nintendo controller port onto the board. But to make sure that I'm going to line this controller port up correctly, put the Super Nintendo controller port in there. And then I'm going to grab this piece of our case. This bottom part here is where the Consolizer is going to slide in. So go ahead and slide the Consolizer board as far as it will go. Make sure the port is lined up. Then we can flip it over and get some solder on one of these pins. And now while holding a different pin, we can kind of press forward on the port, heat up that first pin again, and try to push that port as far forward as it will go. I think once upon a time, Game Tech says that if you put a Super Nintendo controller into the port, it makes this step a little easier, as far as lining up these pins. And now we can solder the rest of the pins. And if you're satisfied with that, go ahead and unplug the controller and take the Consolizer out of the shell. Now, so that they don't run into the case, let's go ahead and trim these pins short. I use an older beat up pair of side cutters for this. Wow, look at that, I actually broke these side cutters. Alright, with the controller port on there, let's put this aside too. And we can grab the power switch as well as the little PCB thing that goes with it. Now if you look at the little PCB, you'll notice that there's 3 pads, however they're not labeled at all. Thankfully, I accidentally ordered an extra one when I ordered my case from Laser Bear, and his are labeled. So we'll keep that in mind for later, but let's get this switch soldered to this PCB. We're just going to place the switch into the PCB, should slide right in. Just flip it over and solder the switch into the PCB. Now that the switch is all soldered up, I'm going to do something that I'm not sure is going to work or not. I have this bag of LEDs that I got when I was building my mechanical keyboard. These are 3-volt LEDs, so I'm going to go ahead and use one of them here. If you look at the switch, there's this little round part here with a plus and a minus. That's for an LED. So I'm going to try to solder this 3-volt LED on here and see if it works. Although if it's okay with you guys, I'm going to use the Laser Bear one that actually has all the labels on it. Really, the only reason I'm trying this is because there's already a resistor here that should lower the voltage here so they don't fry this LED. I'm not 100% on the math for that, what resistor is required, but we're just gonna see if this resistor is enough for this LED. So let's go ahead and put the longer leg here on the positive. And let's try to solder one of the legs in there. And then we could solder the other. And once it's soldered in, we can go ahead and cut those legs to length. Now, in order to hook up our switch to the Game Boy Advance Consolizer board, we're gonna have to solder some ribbon cable here between the pads here on the switch to these pads up here on the Consolizer. Just got a 3-wire piece of ribbon cable. Let's go ahead and strip and tin it. And then we can tin our switch. And we can solder our wire onto the switch. And now we can do the same thing on the other side to the Consolizer. With the switch hooked up to the Consolizer, we can start to assemble the Consolizer into the case. We're going to need to attach these two ribbon cables. The smaller one here is actually the flex cable that we soldered onto the Game Boy Advance CPU, but the other one is dependent on which LCD flex cable this GBA had. If you look at my GBA, mine says 32 right there, so that means that we're gonna need the flex cable that's still left on our flex cable kit here. If yours says 40 there, then you're gonna use the white one that's included with the kit instead. So let's grab this flex cable. Put this flex cable into that connector. The text on the flex marks this side up, but basically the pins are going to be facing up. Go ahead and close the connector. And now let's open up the two flex connectors on the Consolizer. Now let's attach this larger flex cable to the Consolizer. The text on the flex says this side up, so I think it's pin side down. And now we can attach this other one to the other connector. With the flex cables installed, now we have to attach this case piece. This might be a little bit difficult to capture on the camera. First, I'm gonna slide the Consolizer piece into the bottom. Gotta make sure that the controller port slides all the way forward. Now we can slide the Game Boy Advance PCB into these slots on either side of the case here. Making sure that this port here sticks out the front. All right, now we can grab the rest of the shell. I'm gonna carefully put the switch into this little slot on the side here. You'll see a little tab here that has to fit in the tab in the PCB. Then we can add the port cover to the Consolizer. These little tabs on the left and right should actually be flush with the Consolizer PCB. Now we can very carefully slide the whole thing in the front of the case here. But our final challenge is going to be to get the headphone jack and the volume knob thing into these gaps here. I find you have to like push the PCB a little bit against the case. The case is a little bit flexible. Okay, that was actually a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. It's very hard to line up this port cover part with the tabs that it's supposed to go into on either side here, while also trying to get these ports in here and make sure that this slides down evenly. But now we can put the cover on, and that just snaps into place. And the little switch cover goes right over the power switch. Hey, that's pretty satisfying. And that's everything all assembled. Let's go test it out, and I'll give you my thoughts. When you first get into a game, you'll notice that there won't be any audio. If you press down and select, you'll open up the Consolizer menu, then go over to the System menu, and you can enable this DVI Plus mode. This is supposed to add audio into the HDMI, however, I noticed on this Consolizer, this does not work very well. Either the TV or the capture card doesn't like it, or it introduces a really loud buzzing sound depending on the game that you're trying to play. So unfortunately, for this Consolizer and this firmware, I have to leave this DVI Plus setting off, and then I just have to capture audio directly from the headphone output of the Consolizer. If you go into the picture menu, there's a couple of options. For me, I like to change the color to the Game Boy Advance palette because it's just a little bit less bright and it looks a little more natural to me. The other setting that I care about is the zoom setting. So instead of a 4x scale with a border, you can go to 4.5 times non-integer scaling, but it's full height, or you could do a 5x scale, which is full width, but it cuts off the top of the screen. So I would stick with either 4.5 times or 4 times. If you go into scan lines here, there is a grid scan line, which is supposed to look more like a real CRT versus the normal standard scan lines. But I don't like scan lines at all, so I'll turn those off.
If you're a big fan of the Game Boy Advance, I think this is a really awesome mod. A lot of people will talk about using a GameCube and the Game Boy player, but I think that this is a little bit more convenient. You don't have to go into Swiss and enable Game Boy interface at all. You just have to start the Consolizer. I do think it's missing some of the more advanced features from like the PS1 digital, such as Wi-Fi firmware updates and decent integration of the audio into the HDMI. I don't think that DVI Plus mode works very well, at least with my setup. The use of a ribbon cable instead of the QSB and all the little wires, I think makes for a much cleaner install, but you do need that flex cable soldering skill set, which makes this mod a little bit uncomfortable for some people. The new case style is pretty cool, although I'm kind of missing the clear top that my original Game Boy Consolizer had. If this video helped you install your GBA Consolizer, give it a like and get subscribed so that you don't miss any of my latest mod tutorial videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.